Welcome, gun runner.
Hello everybody, it's Kieran aka the Retro Alert here, and I've got a hardware review for you today, as you can no doubt see. Now before I get started properly, pre-warning, all four of my cats are in the vicinity. I think they're all interested in being in the video, so don't be surprised if a cat suddenly jumps on the keyboard in front of the keyboard, or in front of the camera, sorry. One of them is the lovely little Daisy, who many of you will have seen in my previous videos. She's a lot bigger now. She's still a kitten and she's still just as naughty, but she's a lot bigger than probably when you last saw her. So there we go, there's the warning out the way. So those of you following me on social media would have seen that I acquired this computer fairly recently, and I was quite excited because I got it for an incredibly good price. I've been after an MSX for absolutely ages to add to my collection. Not just because I wanted one, but also I've written a couple of books on the MSX, and it obviously helps if I've got my own machine to play games on and test some real hardware and stuff like that. Which is, yeah, so it's made things a lot easier for me in that respect. And it is a JVC HC-7E. I've never seen this model of the MSX before ever, until I saw the eBay auction that I bid on. Actually, I got it for an incredibly good price, and as I say, I had been looking for one for ages, but on eBay UK, MSXs usually seem to go for about £80 to £100. 9 times out of 10 they were the really common Toshiba model, the quite small one. And I wanted something a bit more interesting than that one, and I kept looking, and I had a search set up to alert me to new items. This one came up from a seller in Italy, of all places, and I was watching it and umming and ahhing over it, and then he sent me an offer to get it for a cheaper price. I already had an eBay voucher to get 10% off. This was around Christmas time. And so I decided to go for it, and I think all in all, with the discounts that I got, including postage and obviously converting from euros to pounds, I paid less than £50 for it, including shipping, which I think is an absolute bargain. The only fault with it, as you will see shortly, is there's one key missing. Should have pointed another arm actually instead of putting it in front of the camera. But I can live with that for the price I got it for, especially considering it's one of the more unusual models. And we will look over it in a moment. I've got it hooked up to a television because when I've done a couple of these before, people have actually moaned when I've not had the hardware connected up to a television, which I always thought was strange. So I tried to find somewhere in the house where I could do it, where I still had plenty of light and I had enough room to be able to lay everything out. And right in front of my living room window on the shoe cupboard seemed like the perfect place. And as you can see, it boots straight into MSX Basic version 1, copyright 1983 Microsoft. And I think a lot of people forget that the MSX was a co-creation of Microsoft, the ASCII Corporation, and Spectra Video. And Spectra Video were developing the first versions of the hardware before pulling out of the project completely, and ironically they actually came back in later on and produced their own versions of the MSX after producing a computer first that was the SV318, I think it is, that was almost identical to the MSX but ended up not being compatible. And after that failed, they actually did end up making MSX machines. So Spectra Video were there originally and then came kind of back into the fold somewhat later on. But the two most important companies were probably ASCII Corporation and Microsoft Japan. Kaz Nishi, who was one of the founders of ASCII Corporation, was also the chairman of Microsoft Japan, so that's where that link comes in as well. But apparently, according to a bit of research and stuff I've been reading up on the MSX, apparently Bill Gates was actually quite involved in it as well from the US side, and he was quite keen to see how the project went. And the idea obviously behind the MSX was to create a standard for all home computers so they could share the technology and be built by different manufacturers, which again, quite ironically, is ended up being the IBM PC standard. And part of the reason for IBM PC standard success was Windows, which Microsoft developed. So Microsoft had a hand in both those, the MSX and obviously the later IBM PC compatible standard. And the real reason that the MSX wasn't wasn't really pushed in America even at all was actually because around the same time that the MSX had been released in Japan, Microsoft in America got involved in the whole PC standard over there. They didn't want to annoy people like IBM, so therefore they kind of didn't bring MSX over to the US, which is a bit of a shame really. They had kind of a conflict of interest there, fingers in a lot of pies. Of course, Microsoft did make BASIC for a lot of other companies too, so they were certainly pretty influential in those early days of computing, and obviously still are. So let's have a bit more of a look at the machine itself. Now we've got a little bit of the history of the MSX out of the way. I will go back to some more of that later on. So I'm going to move the camera in a little bit. So it's quite large. Let's see if I can stand it up actually. There we go. It's going to slip down though. But I want you to see how this one's quite deep. It's not that wide, but it's very, very deep, with that big ridge at the top. And one thing I noticed straight away about this MSX, as I say, I'd never actually seen one of these models ever before, and certainly not at a show or event or anything. I've never even seen pictures of them. And then funnily enough, after I posted that I'd bought this one on Twitter, two other people came up and said that they owned this same model too, which is quite funny, including Cara the Broken. So shout out to Cara the Broken, who has given me a lot of tips and helps in terms of the MSX. So here we are. So one thing to notice straight away is that there's no cartridge slots on the top. Usually the MSXs have a cartridge slot somewhere up here along the top part, and it doesn't have that, but it does boast just up here that this one has RGB video output, which is bloody awesome. So I've just got it connected with a standard SCART cable, which I will show you shortly. It also boasts that it has 64 kilobytes of RAM with 32 kilobytes of ROM. So that was generally the best setup to have the 64K. I think there were later MSXs that had 128K, but they weren't really supported. 64K was considered the best one to have, although they went as low as 16K apparently, but I can't imagine there were many games that supported 16K at all. And yeah, so it does say that it has two cartridge ports there, so you're probably wondering where those are, so we will show you in a moment. So keyboard layout as well, fairly standard. All MSXs have these cursor keys on the keyboard, which is pretty good really, because obviously you could use it to control the games if you didn't have a joystick. So it's kind of almost like a built-in control. And actually, that's a little bit of a hangover from the Spectra Video 318, which actually had a built-in joystick on that side instead, which is I always thought looked pretty cool. But apparently, they're really prone to breaking, so not so great. Let's have a look around the machine. So on the left-hand side there, we have two standard joystick ports. One good thing that I like about the MSX is they're a normal Atari 9-pin D sockets, as you can see. MSX joysticks usually have two buttons, more like a console joystick would, like an NES pad or something. So you'll find that most MSX joysticks do have two buttons. And I have some brilliant Quick Shot Maverick joysticks. I'll pop a picture of that in the top corner for those interested, which is kind of like a small arcade stick. And that actually has a switch on the bottom. You can switch it to support MSX. So it will support MSX with two-button control, which is really good. So on the back, here. Printer port. I love the fact that it's still got the cover on it, so it's obviously never used. We've got our SCART socket there, and that's the power lead hanging at the back because the power supply is in here. It's built in, so no external power supply, which is great as well. Really good. I was quite pleased about that. Our cassette port for tape loading if we want to do that. A monitor port so we can connect it up to a monitor as well. Reset button. RF out, so we use RF out. And there we go. That is one of the cartridge ports. And actually flicking that then made the MSX reset. I don't know if you caught that. There must be a trigger in there that knows when you're putting a cartridge in. And then we've got another one on the side there, and actually says, caution, be sure to plug or unplug the ROM cartridge only after the power is switched off. The slot flap is released power is switched off, deleting the program. So there we go. Yeah, it says about the flaps. So it should do it again with that. It does. So there's a trigger on there to reset the MSX. That's quite interesting. It's funny that those labels are still there. It shows how well it was looked after, apart from that key being missing. That makes it even more of a shame that that key is missing in a way. There's two cats behind the TV at the moment. I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see them. There we go. That's Jasper on the left there, and he's the biggest cat I have. He's a Norwegian forest cat, and there's Bertie, who's the oldest but the smallest, on the right there. So introduction to my cats. So what else have we got to show you? Well, I have actually got a cartridge here to show you the cartridge loading. So let me just grab that and we'll put it in. So here we are. This is my cartridge, my one and only MSX cartridge that I have. Xerion by Jaleco. I do have a load of MSX tapes actually in my garage in a box, which I've had for some time. But obviously I'd have to sort out a way of tape loading, which I'm not particularly interested in. There are better solutions. I think there's some flash devices and such like nowadays that you can use with the MSX. Yeah, Xerion cartridge. Really strange. It's got that hole through it. Now you can see that. Never seen that with any kind of cartridge games before. And there's another one there, look, on the bottom with a groove. So that's very different. But also has a spring loader like a lot of old Atari 2600 games to protect it on there. One thing I did want to mention though is that actually getting games is not that easy. I was looking on eBay, and the cheapest game I could find on cartridge, loads of tapes. Tapes are super cheap. You can get tapes for, you know, for a couple of pounds. But the cartridge game's much harder. I ended up ordering this from Japan, and this cost me £20, including postage. The cheapest game I could find was actually a baseball game, which I didn't really want a baseball game, for 15. But nearly all the cartridges I found on eBay were in Japan. I didn't find any from European sellers really, which is kind of annoying. But yeah, tape games seem to be very common, discs games less so, and cartridge games seem to be the hardest to find. Unless you're looking, looking from Japan, which yeah, for a machine that had cartridge loading, you know, it seems strange that it was so hard to find. I mean, for example, the Atari 8-bit, which has a lot in common with the MSX in the fact that, you know, cartridge was kind of the main medium it was designed for. You know, cartridge games are not that hard to find at all. So yeah, I guess when it was released in the UK and Europe, it was promoted more as a machine that could play discs and tapes like, you know, the ZX Spectrum and Commodore 64 and such like. So let's stick this in. Okay, so just discovered that with this particular MSX, you have to put the cartridge slot in the back. The cartridge in the back cartridge slot. It does not work on the side one. So there we go, it works fine. So you can, one play start, press one key join, two play start, press two. So there we go. A conversion of the Jaleco arcade game, Exerion. It works absolutely perfectly, which is brilliant to see. I also have been showing some gameplay clips throughout this video, but I just wanted to show that the cartridge loading does indeed work perfectly. So there we go. We've got that part sorted. I'll just reset it there. So yeah, some other details about the MSX that I think are worth talking about. What's on the bottom as well? Not a lot. There's a serial number. It's that and I've talked a little bit about it trying to compete with the Spectrum and Commodore 64 and stuff like that. And you know, it never really took off in Europe as a whole, but it was popular in some specific regions. So in the Netherlands in particular, the MSX was hugely popular. I believe it was the most popular 8-bit computer in the Netherlands, and the main reason for that is because one of the manufacturers that over there was Philips, of course, who, you know, huge, one of the biggest electronics manufacturers in the world, certainly the biggest in Europe, and they produced their own versions of the MSX1, so this is, and the later MSX2, which was a upgraded version of this with better graphics and sound, basically, and a slightly faster processor, I think. And the MSX machines, obviously, the Philips MSX machines are pretty easy to find from the Netherlands if you go looking around, and some of them are very, very nice looking, actually. But yeah, because Philips were obviously so big over there, they employed so many people in the Netherlands. The Philips MSX was hugely popular. So it had you know, a lot of the MSX games. If you look on the Planet MSX database online, you'll find a huge amount of games that originate from the Netherlands. The other country where it was also very popular for some reason was Spain. I've not been able to find out the exact reason why it was so popular in Spain, but someone suggested it was actually to do with when home computers first started arriving, you know, affordable home computers. The Spanish brought in this rule about tax, that if a computer was 64K or over, I think it was, you paid less tax, which is why they released a version of the Amstrad CPC, which I think has 72K instead of 64 because it took it over. And I think with the MSX, they argued that because it had such a large ROM or something like that. But that was a suggestion that someone told me when I asked a few people. I don't know how true that is, so shoot me if I'm wrong. You know, feel free to comment if you know why the MSX was so popular in Spain. I can get a definitive answer. Another answer that someone gave me is that apparently one of the people who distributed machines, MSX machines in Spain, was just one of the biggest, you know, electronics distribution companies. So therefore, they chose the MSX for some reason, probably because they could get them cheap, and so they kind of just got a lot of focus in stores and stuff where maybe other computers didn't. So a few more things to mention about the MSX is I haven't really gone much into the hardware, but it does use a Z80 CPU inside, the same as the Spectrum and Amstrad do. And the Spectrum part is something that should be noted, because if you look at the MSX games that were developed in the UK, and there is actually a lot of them, considering the machine had limited success over here, there is a lot of UK developed MSX games, and a lot of the reason for that is because it was so easy to port them from the Spectrum, because the MSX graphics display uses the same resolution as the Spectrum and can basically display Spectrum graphics in almost the same way. So because a lot of Spectrum games were done in monochrome because of problems with attribute clash, it was really easy to just port those games over to the MSX with very, very little changes. I mean, I'm showing an example of that in the corner right now. So you will get a lot of you know, the real MSX fans moaning about these lazy Spectrum ports, where they literally took the Spectrum code and just had it working on the MSX. And the other thing is as well, the sound chip in the MSX is near identical to the sound chip in the 128K Spectrum. So again, the sound was super easy to port over as well. But I have found through playing a lot of MSX games that a lot of 128K Spectrum games that had really nice YM music, the music isn't in the MSX versions. I can only assume that's to do with the difference in RAM, because obviously 64K, that's half the RAM. So I'm guessing that's probably why they cut the music out, rather than the fact that the MSX couldn't do it as such. So yeah, unfortunately a lot of the MSX games that originated from the UK, and even some from some of the Spanish companies, even like Dynamic, who are probably one of the most famous Spanish software companies, a lot of their games on the MSX were actually just Spectrum ports, which is a bit of a shame, really. Well, they did do some good stuff as well, but yeah, it did get plagued. It did get plagued, and as I kind of mentioned earlier, the machine was later replaced with the MSX2, then the MSX2 Plus, and then lastly there was an MSX Turbo R, which I believe was only made by Panasonic. They were the only manufacturers of the Turbo R. All the previous machines, the MSX 1 and 2, had a multitude of different manufacturers, JVC, Sony, Toshiba, Hitachi, Yamaha, Casio, Philips, Gold Star, Sony, most famously the Sony Hitbit machines. I actually did a video on Sony's involvement with the MSX and how people forget that they did produce games machines before the PlayStation. So that's worth a watch if you want to know more about Sony's involvement with the MSX in the early years. Unfortunately, the Sony MSX Hitbit machines never made it to the UK, which is a shame because they look really cool. So yeah, that's pretty much all there is to tell you about the MSX, really. So the last question remains, I suppose, is the MSX worth buying today? And I kind of already mentioned that they're not the easiest computers to find, and the price of them in the UK is quite high. But I've actually grown to really, really love the MSX. I had limited experience with it probably up until about a year or so ago, when I'd been playing on one quite a lot at the at RCM in Leicester, the Retro Computing Museum, and they had a kind of flash cartridge thing hooked up to theirs, and I was playing a few games on one there, and that got me intrigued, and looking online got me even more intrigued. And then when it came around to writing books, I really wanted to do it on the MSX, so I started playing a large portion of its catalogue through the Blue MSX emulator, and found it to be a very capable machine. Enjoyed the music because it's the same as the 128K Spectrum, and I love the sound of the YM sound chip in the Spectrum. And I like the way its graphics look, although it's only got 16 colours. I think they could make the graphics look really, really nice on the MSX, because though they only had 16 colours, the 16 colours were well balanced across the palette. Not like the kind of the C64 palette where you've got kind of a lot of brownish colours and the pastel colours. The MSX had a proper full range of different colours, which I think was really good. The more I played the MSX from emulation for writing my books, the more I grew to love it. And that's a lot of what prompted me to go and buy my own machine. And I don't regret it. I'd actually like to pick up quite a few games for it, or some kind of flashcard solution, so I can play more games on it, because I think it's really good, especially for if you like arcade style games. It's almost in a way like a computer version of the Famicom, because it shares a lot of the Japanese games with the Famicom, and a lot of the same people made games for it. I suppose the most notable people obviously who made games for the MSX well, the most notable person was Konami. They heavily supported the MSX with a lot of titles, and some of their games even had chips on the cartridges for like sound enhancement and things like that. So yeah, the MSX games are particularly impressive. The Konami games on the MSX are particularly impressive, but a lot of other people supported it too. Like Jaleco. Sony even produced games for the MSX as well. So in Europe, there was some support from people like Ocean and US Gold and Grand Slam and people like that, but they were all Spectrum ports. So the really good stuff, all the really good stuff came from Japan. There is some good stuff from Spain as well. I mentioned Dynamic. There was Topo Soft was another one from Spain, I believe. Just trying to recall the names of all the Spanish companies. The French company Infogrames, they quite heavily supported the MSX as well, although they were sometimes Spectrum ports. So yeah, there was a lot of the big companies supporting it with games, and there is a really large selection of games for it, but particularly some really good arcade style titles, especially from Konami and Jaleco in particular, I think. So yeah, I think it is. If you don't mind the high cost of collecting the hardware and the games, I think it's certainly a machine that you should have in your collection, especially if you're a fan of 8-bit computers like me. And I really love the MSX. And another thing I should actually mention is, that I forgot to mention earlier before I go, is the MSX is very, very, very closely related to ColecoVision. I mentioned earlier about the connection with with Spectra Video and the early versions of the MSX hardware that developed, that ended up being their early computers, the SV318, etc. The ColecoVision was based on the early version of that Spectra Video hardware, as was the Sega SG-1000, which is why the games look near identical, and a lot of games were ported between the systems as well. And there were some other computers actually that used the same video chip as the MSX, so the graphics look very, very similar, like the Tatting Einstein and the Memorex MTX. I think that the Texas TI-99 used the same graphics chip as the MSX as well. So there were some other systems where it was kind of easy to port stuff across. And indeed, in the MSX, it has a really, really hardcore homebrew community. There's still loads of new games being released for the MSX, and a lot of them are even out. You can buy them on cartridges with boxes and everything. And one thing that some people in the MSX community have been doing is porting titles across from other machines, like the ColecoVision, because it's so easy to do that. So games that weren't released on the MSX but were released on the ColecoVision, for example, people have been ported across them to the MSX, and vice versa. Actually, you see a lot of the homebrew for the ColecoVision is actually ported from the MSX because of the similarities in the hardware. Yes, I'm done now. Sorry to waffle on. Is the MSX worth having in your collection? Definitely, but you'll need a large wallet if you're going to take it seriously. I hope you've enjoyed my look at the MSX, in particular the JVC HC-7, and I will see you all again for another video very soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.